Okay, in today's lesson, we're going to be talking about the roots of self-government. Now, we've covered all the 13 English colonies. Remember, up in the north, you have the New England colonies, and that's Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire. Then you have the middle colonies of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. And then, right along the Pennsylvania-Maryland border is called the Mason-Dixon line. And once you get south of the Mason-Dixon line, those are the southern colonies. And they are made up of Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia. Okay? Now, up until this time, a lot of these colonies have been areas where people who have been persecuted, especially up in New England, can go and seek religious freedom. Pennsylvania also, as well as Maryland. Georgia, if you remember, was started as a social experiment to help debtors in England. And, back in England, they're probably happy to get rid of these people. They're out of their hair, right? But now so many people have come to the colonies, to the New World, that England says, hey, wait a minute now. We should be making some money off all these colonies. All right? So let's talk about that first. Okay, so England begins to regulate the trade in the colonies. Now, England believed, and not just England, but almost all European countries that had colonies, but England believed that the colonies should benefit the home country, right? So they believe in a system called mercantilism. Mercantilism. And that's the economic belief that a nation becomes strong by keeping strict control over its trade, right? Now, here's two terms I really want you to understand, and that is exports and imports, all right? The easiest way to think about this, I think, is if you think about export, think of like exit. It's leaving your country. You're selling it to somebody else. Okay, that's an export. An import, think of import, think of import. All right, bringing it in. All right. But it's very important that a country exports or sends other goods to other countries more than it brings in. Why? Because when you sell them your stuff, when you export your goods, what are they giving you in return? Well, they're giving you money. They're giving you gold. So you take your stuff, you send it to another country, and then they give you money, gold, right? So it's very important to export more goods than imports. So if you're a country that has to import food or import natural resources, you're bringing that stuff in because you need it, but you have to give them money, that other country money. So it's important that a country exports more than it imports, all right? So if England sold more goods abroad, export, then gold would flow into England as payment. And that's what they want to do. They want to get rich. So in the 1650, they passed a rule called the Navigation Act, right? It begins in 1650, and it's really going to regulate the trade between England and its colonies. So they make these rules that says only English or colonial ships can transport goods to and from the colonies. They don't want French, they don't want Spanish, they don't want Dutch, only English or colonial ships, all right? And only certain products could only be shipped to England, tobacco and cotton. Why? Because it's going to create jobs for the English back in England, right? If they make sure that they have all the tobacco, and which is becoming a huge deal. Remember, tobacco is the key to success of Jamestown. If England is able to control that trade, they're going to be able to get all the money. They don't want, the colonies selling this or trading this tobacco or cotton to France or the Netherlands or to Germany or Spain, right? Because then they could sell it. If England controls the tobacco and the cotton trade, they're going to make a lot of money. Because first of all, tobacco is very addictive, and it's starting to spread all over Europe, and people are buying this tobacco, but they're only getting it from England. All right? Now, for the colonists, they have a steady trade partner, at least. They know that, they're going to be able to sell all of the stuff to England. But here's the rub. The rub is, what if France offers to pay you more? Or the Netherlands offers to pay you more? You can't sell it to them, right? You can only sell it to England. England sets the price, and that's the price you're going to get. That kind of violates our idea of a free enterprise system. right? So many colonists resented the Navigation Act and they ignore it. All right, so now we need to talk about the triangular trade. I mentioned this briefly in the last lesson. We're going to get into it further today. Now, colonial traders, now they're often referred to as Yankees, and Yankees is a term that applies kind of a clever guy who's going to make money, who always makes good deals. So these Yankee traders, all right, have figured out a way to make a lot of money, and unfortunately, it involves slaves. All right? Now, think of a triangle. It's got three sides, right? So one route was known as triangular trade because three of the legs formed a triangle, like I mentioned. The first thing they would do, they would look around in New England and go, what do we have a lot of? What do we have a lot of? We have a lot of fish and we have a lot of lumber, right? So they would take all this fish and they'd take this lumber and they'd load up their ship and they would go down to the West Indies. Okay? They would then trade all that lumber and fish for molasses. It was kind of like a syrup. And they would go. And by the way, molasses is made from sugar cane. And remember, so those sugar plantations in the West Indies, and of course the people who work in the sugar cane fields are slaves. They would then load up their ships with barrel after barrel after barrel of molasses, and they'd go back up to New England, and they would turn that molasses into rum. Rum is an alcohol. Okay? So now they've traded out the lumber and fish for molasses. They've taken the molasses back up to New England, and they have what? Made rum. Now they're going to take this rum, and they're also going to load their ship with guns, gunpowder, cloth, tools, and they're going to go to West Africa, right? And they're going to trade them and all that good for slaves. Now, they would then take the ship and stuff it with slaves. Remember I showed you those pictures of how horrible those conditions were? They take those slaves to the West Indies, where they needed for the sugar plantations, and they sold them, and they made a huge amount of money. They would take a portion of that profit and they'd buy more molasses. And then the whole process would go again. And every time they sold those slaves in the West Indies, cha-ching, they just made a bunch of money. They would then go do this over again, get back to West Africa, sell the slaves, cha-ching, a whole lot more money. All right? Here's an image of what it looked like. All right, the first leg, they would come down to the West Indies and they would trade all the lumber and fish. They'd then load up the molasses and they would go back to New England where they would trade that turn that into rum. They would then take the rum along with guns and tools of cloth and they go to West Africa. They would trade all that stuff for slaves, and then here is the Middle Passage. Okay? The Middle Passage. And this is the part where all those slaves are crammed on the ships. Okay? Right here. Remember, 10% of these people are going to die. And then it's just a horrible condition. And then they would get here, they would trade those, or basically sell the slaves, make a huge amount of money, use a little bit of that profit to buy more molasses, and they were just getting rich and richer and richer and richer. Okay, so now you know how a lot of those Yankee traders are making a lot of money. All right, so let's talk about how the colonies were governed. Okay, the government in the colonies. Okay, and the head of every colony was a governor. All right, and he directed the affairs of that colony. Now, most of these guys are going to be appointed directly by the King of England or by the proprietor. Remember what a proprietor is? That's a guy, again, who gets the land in exchange for a monthly payment. So he kind of makes the rules. So he picks who's going to be the governor. Now, there's two exceptions to this. Rhode Island and Connecticut, the governor is elected by the colonists. But the other 11, the governor is appointed by the king or the proprietors. Now, each colony does have a legislature. A legislature is a branch of government that makes laws. Now, most of the legislature have two houses, okay? They have an upper house, which is advisors selected by the governor, his buddies, his people who are going to give him advice, okay? And then you have the lower house. The lower house are elected by the colonists. Now, the lower house, even though it sounds like less important because it's the lower house, actually, they approve the laws. They protect the rights of the people, and they have to approve the taxes, right? The governor cannot just, raise taxes without permission and approval of the lower house, which is elected by the people. Very good. Seems like a pretty good deal. So let me tell you about this. Okay, real quick. So the governor is the chief executive. He is the head of the executive branch. Oh, I'm not going to be able to spell that. Executive branch. The legislative branch, like I told you, makes the laws. So you have two branches of government on this. Legislative branch. Okay? Now, remember where the legislative branch can control the power of the purse, the right to raise money. If the governor was to ignore the legislative branch, well, the legislature can then hold the governor's salary. So it's kind of a check on the power of the executive branch. The reason I'm bringing this up, guys, is because we're going to talk about our system of government later on. So I want you to understand the difference between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Now, there's a third branch that we haven't talked about yet, and that's the judicial branch. We'll get to that later, though. Now, let's talk about who had the right to vote in the colonies. All right? Each colony kind of had its own rules, but by 1720, here are some things that almost applied to everybody. Okay? To be able to vote in the colonies, you have to be white. Boom. Which means Native Americans obviously can't. Slaves can't. You have to be white. You have to be a Christian. And in some colonies, you had to belong to the proper church. Remember, all Christians, Catholics and Protestants, are Christians. But in some colonies, you have to belong to the Anglican Church, the Church of England, for instance. All right? So you have to be white, you have to be a Christian, you have to be male. Sorry, ladies, no voting back then. And you have to be a property owner. It means you have to own land. Now, the colonial leaders felt that only people that own property know what's going to be best for the colony. They have a vested interest. If we're going to vote on where a new road's going to go or what we should do, they feel that people that own land are the people who are going to make the best decisions because they have a vested interest. So if you're a blacksmith, unfortunately, you probably don't own land. Or if you are a seamstress, or a tailor, or one of the artisan class, you probably don't own land, therefore you can't vote. So basically, these are going to be farmers. So you must be a white, male, Christian property owner to be able to vote in the colonies back by that time. In that time. Okay, let's talk about the glorious revolution of 1688. All right, so there's big upheaval and unrest in England, and Parliament is so upset with the King James II, because I think he's Catholic, and he's talking about maybe even making England back to a Catholic country. They remove him. They get rid of the king. He flees to France. And they ask their enemy, the Netherlands, remember the Netherlands and England. Remember, by the way, the king had gone to war with England. Remember the property that we took, New Netherlands, used to belong to the Dutch. Remember, England and the Netherlands had gone to war, and England has taken all that property. Well, they go back and they get rid of their own king, and they ask the Netherlands, their king and queen, William and Mary, to rule in the king's stead. Wow, that seems really weird. That'd be like us going to Canada and saying, hey, we got rid of our president and we want the Canadian Prime Minister to govern the United States. I mean, very odd. All right. Well, in exchange, William and Mary have to sign the English Bill of Rights. In the English Bill of Rights is a written list of freedoms the government promised to protect. One of these is that it's a trial by jury. You can't just be clapped into jail without a trial. So you're going to have a trial by jury. And the ruler, the king or queen, cannot raise armies or taxes without the consent of Parliament. So you start to see the power of the king begin to dissipate, and the king is the chief executive, and you start seeing Parliament, which is a legislative organization, begin to take more power. All right. Now, the Bill of Rights really applied mainly to men. So, in most cases, women, obviously slaves and natives, are not going to be protected by these laws. All right. So, there you have it. We've talked about mercantilism, how important it is for the colonies to make money for the homeland. We've talked about the Navigation Act, where the colonies really begin to resent that because they're forced to sell their goods only to England, regardless of the price they could get in the open market. We talked about the triangular trade and how colonial Yankee traders are making a lot of money trading basically for slaves. All right? And then finally, we talked about how the colonial government works. Okay? When we get back, we're going to talk about our very last section in this unit called Life in the Colonies. Talk to you later.